Good evening, members and officers of the Council and members of the public, the imaginary ones. Welcome to this meeting of the Governance and Audit Committee. Just a couple of housekeeping. The fire evacuation procedure, the fire alarm is, if it is activated, vacate the offices via the stairs. Please do not use the lifts. Assemble in Hawley Square on the Green. Officers will assist you and advise you when it is deemed safe to return the chamber. Does anyone intend to film the meeting? Nope. Fabulous. Restriction on mobile phones. Would everyone present please ensure their mobile phones are turned to silent and that they are not used to make or receive phone calls in the chamber whilst meeting is progress. Please note this meeting is being live streamed for members of the public. The meeting will also be recorded and will be subsequently broadcast on the Council's YouTube channel. Are there any members who wish to speak under Council Procedure Rule 20.1? I can't see any. Apologies for absence. There have been apologies received from Councillor Whitehead. Are there any other apologies for absence? No? Grand. Agenda item 2, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? Fab, this is going really well. Let's keep going. Agenda item 3, minutes of the meeting held on 30th November 2023. To approve the minutes of the meeting held on 30th November 2023, copy attached to the agenda pack. Please can I have a proposer and a seconder? Although before I do that, there was one action on the minutes of the last meeting, which I think was for Mr. Webb, about an update for subject of cash collection at this meeting.
Thank you, Chair. We are currently undertaking another audit of car parking and enforcement, and we should have that finalised in time for the next meeting of this committee, which I think is in July.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Webb. Any other questions or comments raised on the minutes? Fabulous. Please can I have a proposer and a seconder. Proposer by Councillor Garner, seconded by Councillor Shrub. Unless I hear any objections, I will take these as approved. Fab. Agenda item 4, quarterly internal audit update report. Mr. Simon Webb, would you please provide your update?
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. This is our regular quarterly internal audit update report summarising the work of the East Kent Audit Partnership on your behalf since the last meeting of this committee, together with details of our performance to the 31st of December. If I could draw your attention to the table on page 15, that summarises the 6 new audits completed during this period. We were pleased to report substantial assurance in 3 of those areas, those being business rates, discretionary housing payments, and also Officer Code of Conduct, Register of Interests and Gifts and Hospitality. We concluded reasonable assurance in the area of safeguarding and a split assurance in respect of dog warden, fly tipping and litter enforcement. Most areas were reasonable assurance, apart from litter enforcement, which attracted a no assurance audit conclusion, primarily because the Council doesn't currently undertake any litter enforcement activity. The final area was complaints monitoring, and unfortunately that also attracted a no assurance opinion. The details of that are given on page 22. I can say that the Council has more recently, since the closure of field work and finalisation of that report, updated its complaints procedures, and we hope by the time we come back to do the follow-up in the next couple of months that should at least be up to reasonable assurance. The results obviously will be reported back to a future meeting of this committee, hopefully the July meeting. Follow-up is a very important part of our work. We don't just take management's word for it that they've implemented the recommendations agreed at the time of each audit. We go back 3 to 6 months later and check. During the period under review, we undertook 5 follow-ups, and they are detailed in the table on bottom of page 23 into page 24. None of those areas were still limited or no assurance after follow-up, and the vast majority of the recommendations had all been agreed and fully implemented at the time of follow-up, which is very pleasing to see. Page 26 of that report, that shows the progress against the agreed 22-23 internal audit plan to the 31st of December. Pleased to report that as at 31st of December, which obviously is the three-quarter mark through the year, we had achieved exactly 75% of the agreed number of days. As at 28th of February last week, we were up to about 95%, so we're well on target to complete your plan. We're very much coming to the end of our work for this year. Annex 4 on page 31 shows the areas which the areas where we have concluded limited or no assurance. They are still to be followed up, and they will be reported to future meetings of this committee. For example, complaints monitoring is at the bottom of that table, and we will be following that up, as I just mentioned, and reporting back hopefully in July. Final appendix to this report is the balanced scorecard. This is a balanced scorecard of key performance indicators for the East Kent Audit Partnership itself. Probably the key one there is the progress against plan, which, as I mentioned, is 75% as at 31st of December. Cost per audit day we calculate once a year, and that will be in the annual report that will come to this meeting in July. Details of staff qualified, satisfaction questionnaires returned, etc. are all detailed within that report as key performance indicators. That concludes my presentation, Chair, but obviously happy to take any questions on any of the items raised. Thank you.
Members, any questions or comments? Councillor Garner.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Webb, for the report. I mean, my disappointment is honed in on the dog warden fly tipping and litter enforcement report. I mean, it is very disappointing that we do not have any littering I mean, it doesn't come as much of a surprise, but it's still disappointing that we don't have any litter enforcement staff employed by the council, and that means that we are unable to fulfil our promise to residents. And this is residents who, when questioned in surveys, put littering really quite high up the priority. Did you get any feedback about how this? I mean, I realise we're a few weeks away from an election now, so that things will hopefully change after the election, and we'll have I won't make a party political point, but did you have any feedback on the reasons for this and what might be being done to make sure we do have littering enforcement staff?
Thank you, Councillor. As members are probably aware, the Council has previously employed contractors to undertake this activity. It's not necessarily a terribly popular activity with certain members of the public, primarily those that drop the litter. That contract did come to an end, however, and the Council hasn't yet put in place an alternative vehicle of delivery, be that in-house staff or an external contractor. If we compare it, for example, to the CEOs who do car park enforcement, we do struggle to recruit to those types of roles. We currently have about 5 vacancies for car park enforcement officers, which is about half of the establishment of car park enforcement personnel, primarily because it can be very confrontational, and of course litter enforcement would be similar. So it is an area that the Council needs to consider how it is going to deliver in the future, but we will probably need to be realistic about our chances of recruiting to those types of roles. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Chris, or if members were happy with that.
Thank you, Simon. Yes, as Simon said, we did have a contract in place with a company called Kingdom. They provided services to other authorities. I don't think it was provided to our satisfaction, as I think my knowledge of it, that the fines were issued in a number of cases for what you would consider relatively minor offences, people dropping cigarette butts and the like, which of course is still littering, but not perhaps focus on some of the more serious concerns that I'm sure our residents have. We are looking at what we can do in terms of enforcement, litter enforcement going forward in the future. You'll be aware as part of the budget we've put the coastal enforcement officers in. They'll be able to undertake some of that activity during the peak season when they're working on the coastal areas, but also during the quieter months when it's off peak. There'll obviously be less coastal sort of enforcement activity they'll be doing, and they'll be able to undertake some of that litter enforcement activity around the town areas during off peak season. But we will obviously continue to review this because this is a new initiative that we're putting in place to see how successful or otherwise it is.
Follow up, maybe a suggestion, because I'm sure finding people to do littering enforcement and the other enforcement roles, as you state, is difficult because some of the confrontations they have potentially. But I mean, this must be the same among other councils across East Kent and across the rest of Kent. And I would assume or would hope that other councils maybe have ways around this, and they are able to employ enforcement officers. So would it be worth us engaging with some of those other councils to learn from those that are doing it successfully, so as we can maybe use some of the practices they use, so as we can make a better success of it?
Chair, for me. So we're a member of the Kent Medway Environment Group, so we're constantly working and with other councils and trying to learn from best practice wherever possible. I think just again touching on some of the points around the difficulties of enforcement, it does differ to where we're talking about car parking enforcement. It's easier to issue a ticket for car parking. You've got a vehicle registration, you can issue a ticket there to the vehicle. When you're dealing with litter or even graffiti enforcement, it is a much harder activity to enforce, to identify the individuals responsible for it, and to issue the fines appropriately. But we're hoping that the initiative we put in place, we anticipate it will be successful. But the coastal enforcement officers, this is a new branch of enforcement activity that we're putting in place. The primary office has a focus on the coastal activities, as we've sort of discussed as part of the budget setting process, but sort of referred to earlier, I anticipate we'll be able to use them flexibly throughout the year for these types of activities as well.
Councillor Austin.
Can I just ask a follow-up on that one? Because I know you and I discussed during the budget setting process about market supplements and so on. Are we expecting those coastal enforcement officers to be paid maybe a little bit more than we would normally be expecting for the job evaluation that we've done, allowing for the difficulties of the recruitment?
Yeah, well, we have allocated market supplements for the parking enforcement officers because they've been difficult posts to recruit to. We've tried different approaches to recruitment there as well. 0-hour contracts, because some individuals actually prefer that as a mode or a method of employment, particularly for those types of jobs where they can be more seasonal in nature. We are, I'm not sure if it's finished, but I know we recently started the recruitment process for the enforcement officers. Whether a market supplement is applied to it will be obviously dependent on how successful that is. Obviously, if we're able to successfully recruit and retain those staff in those posts, we wouldn't need to offer a supplement. But if we struggle to recruit sufficient staff in number and calibre of employee that we want, we'd again, at that point in time, yes.
Any other questions or comments? Councillor Austin?
Thanks. I'm a new and very fly-by-night member of this committee, so my questions may be rather ignorant. There's a section about the right at the very bottom about the responsive insurance, about corporate leak investigation and berths 4 and 5 and a staff matter. And obviously, I'm assuming that most of that information is confidential, but are you confident that those things are progressing as they should, Mr. Webb, and that we will have some information on those in due course? Because obviously they're, I think, linked to the recommendations that we had from the independent monitoring officer, and it's very important that we fulfil all those requirements.
Thank you, Councillor. Yes, all three of those responsive pieces of work have progressed well and, where appropriate, have come before this committee at previous meetings. In terms of Berth 4-5, that is now at draft report stage and is in the progress of being finalised, and the results will come forward to this committee at a later date, probably July.
If I could come in, Simon, thank you. So we are, as Simon said, rightly, the report now is in draft stage. I've had sight of it. What we are looking to do is get this in front of Cabinet and then to Council during this actual Council period of time. So it should be seen by members prior to election, before the election period. We may be into the pre-election period by the time it reaches councillors, but we want to try and get as close to as possible concluding the recommendations, or at least presenting the progress we've made against the recommendations to council. The route it will take is to Cabinet and council, because although it's a governance related matter, the IMO and the statutory recommendations that were made by Grant Thornton came to council and they were approved by full council. So rather than coming through this committee, it will make its way to full council after being considered and noted by Cabinet.
Any other questions or comments from members? No. Fab. I've got one, not sure if it's a question or a comment. On bullet point 3 of the scope for improvement on page 16, it talks about consideration of official training programme routes for undertaken for both personal and professional staff development. I'm not sure if you can expand, Mr. Webb, or perhaps Chris could, as to how that works, because are they Civica staff or TDC staff? Because I presume if they come under Civica, we have quite little flex in the training, if that could just be a bit expanded upon.
This certainly does refer to Civica staff, yes, absolutely. But obviously they are providing the service on behalf of the council at the present time, and therefore we would expect them to implement the recommendations that are made on the authority's behalf.
Agreeing with what Simon said there, I think it's a very valid recommendation. Civica provide, I think, a high quality service to the council. It's, you would have seen members on this committee, the reports that come in front of you, they are almost always substantial or with an element of reasonable with it. So they are providing, I would say, a high quality service. And that partly is reflected by the quality of the staff that they've got, I would say. And that's, I think, partly where the recommendation comes from, because it's essential for us to retain some of those key staff in there. And that will be for, I've got another role that I undertake as well, which is the head of shared service. I help effectively oversee and manage the contract for the 3 councils that are part of the arrangement with Civica for business rates and council tax. So as much as it being an action for Civica to implement, it's really for a conversation that I need to be having with counterparts at Civica to help them try and to enable us to retain the staff that are providing such a decent service for us.
Cool. With no other questions or comments, we move to the recommendations. The recommendations are that the report may be received by members, that any changes to the agreed 2022 to 23 internal audit plan resulting from changes in perceived risk detailed at point 5.0 of Annex 1 of the attached report be approved. Members consider, where appropriate, requesting an update from the relevant directors to the next meeting of the committee in respect of any areas identified as still having either a limited or no assurance after follow-up. That members consider registering their concerns with Cabinet in respect of any areas of the Council's corporate governance control framework or risk management arrangements in respect of which they have ongoing concerns after the completion of internal audit follow-ups, reviews and update representations from the relevant director. Please can I have a proposer and a seconder? Proposed by Councillor Lees, seconded by Councillor Dexter. Unless I hear any objection, I will take this as approved. Fabulous. Moving on to agenda item 5, we go back to Mr. Simon Webb for the Internal Audit Charter and Draft Internal Audit Plan 2023 to 24.
Thank you, Chair. We seem to be missing the covering report for this agenda item, but we do have the 3 annexes, which are undoubtedly the most important aspect of it. I'll ask the committee clerk to circulate the covering report to you via email after this meeting, and also ensure that it's put onto the council's website. This report is for approval by this committee, so we're asking you to approve the audit charter for the next 3 years and the 23-24 internal audit plan. Of the 3 annexes, Annex A is the internal audit mission statement, which is literally just a paragraph. Annex B is the internal audit charter. We ask you to review this every 3 years. To be honest, nothing really has changed in the last 3 years apart from the addition of the glossary of terms. The Charter sets out the what, why and how of what the East Kent Audit Partnership do for Thanet District Council and the other partners, they being Dover, Folkestone and Hythe and Canterbury councils. We are governed by internal audit standards, namely the public sector internal audit standards. Both Christine Parker and I are chartered internal auditors and are bound by the ethics and standards prescribed by those governing bodies. So as I say, the Charter sets out what we do, how we do it and why we do it, basically back to first principles of internal auditing. Most importantly is Annex C, which sets out our proposed programme of work for 23-24. Members who have been on this committee for some years will be familiar with the format. So Annex C is on page 55 of the agenda pack. We show the complete, well, what we call the audit universe, which we consider to be all auditable areas of the council's businesses, and we break them down between financial governance, housing systems, ICT, human resources, etc. For ease of reference, we are showing the year that we last audited each of those activities, what the assurance level was, and where appropriate I've given that assurance level after follow-up, because of course it may have gone up after follow-up, and the number of days that we're proposing for 23-24, the quarter that they're prioritised for. We also show a 4-year strategic plan, so we are showing notional plans through to 26-27. Now, in accordance with guidance from both SIPFA and the Institute of Internal Auditors, we're only asking you to approve the 23-24 plan this evening, because that guidance says you shouldn't agree a plan for more than 12 months. And indeed, undoubtedly, during the course of the year, the plan will vary slightly. There will be unplanned responsive work, such as the Berth 4-5 project that we undertook in 22-23. Quite rightly, the internal audit plan moves with risk. We have regard to the Council's risk register when preparing the plan. Very high up on your risk register, which you'll see as an agenda item later this evening, is ICT cybersecurity, a very topical issue at the moment. It's gained even more risk due to the Ukraine conflict, as quite a lot of cyber attacks come out of the Russian Federation. You'll notice on page 58 that we have a review of cybersecurity, and we prioritise that for Q1 of 23-24. In putting together the plan, I've met with all heads of service and directors to discuss the emerging risks and opportunities within their service areas. We've also had, as I've mentioned, regard to the risk register, and also our own internal audit perception of risk and internal audit experience of each area of the council's business. I mean, we have been undertaking internal audit for Thanet District Council for the best part of the last 15 years as the East Kent Audit Partnership. Indeed, I myself probably have been doing it for about 30 years, so we do have quite a body of experience of auditing in this authority. So the plan is broken down between financial governance, housing systems, as you would expect, a fair bit of coverage of housing stock, human resources, which came back in-house very recently, obviously, staff are your primary asset, and as payroll is one of the most significant areas of expenditure within the organisation, we undertake a review of payroll every year to ensure that we undertake adequate testing of salaries, expenses and benefits. Corporate governance, very important to the council. It also appears on the risk register, so we break that down into constituent parts and audit certain areas each year. Performance management, an important area of the council's business. Clearly we want assurance that we're delivering on the corporate plan objectives of the organisation, and the best way of doing that is through having well-tailored key performance indicators to ensure that we're achieving as an organisation the outputs that our residents require. We undertake a certain amount of fraud work and propose to undertake some data analytics in terms of data matching certain bodies of data. Procurement, contract audits, they will feature each year. And next year is no exception to that, with reviews of CSO compliance. ICT I mentioned, we got 3 audits planned, one being the cyber security. And then into the service areas of the business, so we're proposing audits of things such as community safety, areas of environmental health, grounds maintenance, very high profile area of the council's business. Employee health, safety and welfare, your leisure, VICs, quite a broad coverage across all areas of the business. The yellow highlighting indicates areas which we aren't covering within a 4-year cycle. Within the Charter, we express a desire to provide coverage of all areas within a 4-year cycle. That's not always possible, so it tends to be the lower risk items that tend to drop out of that 4-year cycle, with some areas, particularly ICT, housing benefits, payroll, etc., being done much more frequently, in the case of payroll, annually. We also, on page 62, have the EKS Civica plan. With ICT coming back in-house from the 1st of April, the ICT audits have come into the main Thanet plan, so that leaves within the Civica plan revenues, benefits, debtors, and I think that's about it now within that area. The plan proposed is for approval if members are so minded. We hope to hit the ground running on the 1st of April, and we'll be auditing from that date against this plan if approved. That's it from me, Chair. So if I could recommend the plan and charter to members for approval, happy to take any questions on any item within the agenda. Thank you.
Any questions or comments from members? Fab. So the recommendation is that the report is received and approved by members. Can I get a proposer? Charlie Lees, and seconded by Councillor Shrub. Unless I hear any objections, I will take this as approved. Perfect. Moving swiftly on to agenda item 6, Q3 review 2022 to 23 Treasury Management Annual Investment Strategy. Mr. Christopher Wandell, will you introduce the report?
Certainly, thank you, Chair. So this is the third quarter report for the committee to note and make comments on in terms of our treasury management activities. So brief reminder, it's not about budgets and expenditure, it's more about how we're managing our cash, what our debt holdings are, what we're doing with any spare money that we've got in terms of investment or otherwise. Headlines you can see in the executive summary that I'll just bring out. Quite concerning, I would say, overall is the main item of concern is the third quarter position. So 75% through the year, you can see that we've only spent £10.5 million against a £50 million budget for the capital programme. So that's 20% spend when you're 75% through the year. Some of that would have just been because of the way the budgets have been set up. They were set up, I would say, they were incorrectly phased when they were first approved. So a lot of the budgets that were approved in relation to some of our regen scheme, in reality, we know they're going to be spent over a longer period of time, but the budgets will have been put solely into this financial year. So there's a profiling issue there in terms of the way the money's been spent out. But undoubtedly there will be some slippage there, the detail of which will come forward to members and Cabinet as part of the budget monitoring process, and that report also goes to OSP for their consideration. In terms of debt and investments, you can see debt position remains largely unchanged. It's around the £20 million mark. We tend to borrow only when we absolutely have to. We use our internal resources rather than going out to external organisations for debt. That remains our position. And we're holding less debt than our capital financing requirements. So in terms of actual money that we've got from the bank, we've got 20 million, but in order to finance all our capital plans, that's 55 million. So actually you can see the majority of the money is the financing of our capital programme is coming from our own internal resources rather than going out to the market to get debt. In terms I've talked about if we've got any spare change to invest, we've just got the slight matter of £55 million worth of balances in our investment, and you can see in the appendix how that is broken down in terms of the types of investments that we use. The large majority of it is placed in money market funds, which are super liquid, low risk investments. And you can see later on in the report, sorry I've skipped around, I've just lost where I was, that the average rate of return that we're getting on those investments is 1.74%. So that's the average for the first 9 months of the year. We obviously know during this year interest rates have gone up, but over the average period of the year we've got around 1.4, but the actual rate we're getting on a money market funds now is closer to the 4% you're getting in terms of base rate. The good news is in terms of this, if you see at 3.7, we budgeted at the start of the year to get £167,000 in terms of investment income because interest rates were so low, 0.5%. We've actually got, for the first 9 months of the year, almost £750,000, and we've factored that into the budget for next year. So you may remember when we set the budget, we put an extra £500,000 worth of investment income into the budget because we're expecting interest rates to go back down. They're probably peaked, I would say now, and our expectation is they'll probably start to taper back down. Depends how the economy performs, but we think that they're unlikely to go much further than they already are. So that's a welcome bonus for us in terms of the performance on treasury management, and certainly helps our overall financial position. That's largely all I've got to say on the reports at this moment in time. As I said, it is for the committee to note, but I'm happy to take any questions that members may have.
Councillor Austin.
Sorry, rookie question. Investments, I noticed we've got £2 million in a deposit fund that's specifically marked as sustainable. What about the rest? I'm thinking about, I know there are councils that have declared climate emergencies that are looking very closely at where they invest. Are they investing in fossil fuels, all that kind of thing? Are we doing that kind of analysis at all?
So we do look at it and consider it. One of the issues with treasury management, and we've looked at this at some depth, is the framework that we have for treasury management puts the onus on us to primarily concern first the security of the investment. So we're not going to, you're not giving me 55 million to put it all on black down at the local casino, and we're going to lose it all. That's definitely not allowed. That's in our treasury management strategy. That's not permitted. Second is liquidity, so we can get the money when we need it. And third is yield. So those are the primary concerns we've got. When we're looking at the sustainable investments, the 2 million we've got is actually a very good investment in terms of return and yield, as well as it having good ESG, environmental, social and governance credentials. If we want to do something that's a little bit more exciting or pushing the envelope, so to say, in terms of environmental or social credentials, you'd need to take it out of the Treasury management framework and put it into the capital programme and say we're actually putting an investment in. We could do this. Obviously, I would provide advice on the worthiness of it. Note of warning, Thanet Council put pretty much all of their money into solar farms and have lost hundreds of millions of pounds from it. So you need to do your due diligence, you need to make sure it's a solid investment, but we still can look at options like that, but it really needs to be outside of this Treasury management framework, because when we're doing that, it's all about how well are you looking after your cash, and environmental concerns are secondary to that, really. It is a frustration, but it's part of the legislative framework that we've got to work with.
Even more stupid rookie question. So the Treasury management framework that we're working within is the legislative framework. We can't. It's not one that we've decided to adopt. But
no, there's a SIP for code of practice.
Yeah.
There's certain rules that we have to comply with.
Yeah.
The external auditors would look very poorly on us. Some of it is set in statutes, and some of it is. Some of it's stuff that you have to do, and some of it's statutory guidance that you have to show and you've considered it. But again, if we didn't pay attention to statutory guidance, we'd be in a lot of bother very quickly, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Chris, you just touched on there about the external auditors. Could you give a quick update as to where we're at?
Thank you, yes. So those who've been on the committee for some time, Mike, you've been, I'd say, a willing volunteer on the final accounts close down group that we've had. Unfortunately, members be aware that the 21-22 final accounts, the draft accounts, are still to be published, so we're almost a year out. There are some mitigating factors and reasons why there's been such delay. We had a very long-standing member of staff who left the authority in March of last year, who was effectively the key member of staff who led the accounts closure process. We still had some COVID restrictions around that time as well. It's very difficult to recruit staff, particularly staff who were willing to come into the office and work in person. The individual that we recruited, the consultant that worked with us, was remotely based, and I think it's fair to say they didn't do the job that they promised they would do for us, and consequently we've had to recruit someone else to undo numerous mistakes that were implemented. We're nearing completion of that now. We're aiming to publish draft accounts by the end of this month or early into April, mainly because we need to get this done, because as of 1st of April, the team will then be working on closing the 22-23 accounts. So that's where we are in terms of production of last year's draft accounts. We still have outstanding as well the audit of the 2021 account that has been largely completed. The auditors aren't here, so I can partly blame them. It has been due in part to resourcing issues at both ends. The external auditors, the manager that manages our audit, had taken a sabbatical and effectively put a pin in that audit. He's actually written to me today, he's returned, and we'll be beginning that shortly. We've got a very similar time frame that we're expecting to wrap that audit up and publish final accounts for 2021 at the end of this month or the beginning of April. So my plan is for the final 2021 accounts, alongside the 21-22 accounts, will have been audited and will come to this committee in July, and at the same time for us to present draft 22-23 accounts. So there's a lot of activity that will be going on within the finance team over the next couple of months. So, thanks.
Many thanks. Councillor Towney.
For us to file. And are there penalties involved when we don't file our accounts? I mean, how come we've got away with it for so long? And, it's ridiculous that we have, in normal circumstances, if I didn't file the accounts of my company, I get fined my company's house. As simple as that. I can be struck off. Yeah. Okay? So why haven't we managed to actually, perform in accordance to the statutory requirements?
So there are statutory requirements. What I would say they are toothless. Apart from being named and shamed and us having to put a notice on our website, there are no implications at all for us not publishing our accounts. I can say that we're not an isolated case. We're probably in the pack. The number of authorities that have not been able to get their audits completed, partly because of the issues in the external audit market at the moment. There's significantly limited capacity in terms of the auditors available to do the work. It's, I would say, stems back to the abolition of the Audit Commission that's happened around 2011, 2012. Prior to that, we had the district auditors that oversaw it. The privatisation of district audit effectively has not worked. It's not, in my view, it's not a sustainable market. So they're looking at putting measures in place to address the audit. That, of course, impacts on the 2021, where there's been delays in the audit. In terms of 21-22, yes, that it's quite clearly it's not acceptable that our draft accounts are a year late, and I can only offer my apologies for the delay. The reasons for that, as I've set out, are because there has been significant turnover in key staff within the service, within the financial service area, and there's also local government accounts are incredibly complex. I mean, those who have seen them will note they are hundreds of pages long with numerous disclosures. You can't just get a standard accountant in to come and close your accounts. There's a very limited pool of specialised accountants who work and who are practitioners of local government accounts. Unfortunately, we didn't get a very good one who came and did our accounts for 21-22. The officer we've got working on it now, again as an interim, but she's extremely competent, extremely capable. She's been with us for a while now. She comes into the office 3 or 4 days a week, which I can say makes a huge difference in terms of being able to work with the team. And as I said, I'm confident that we'll have those published, but that is still late, and I can make no, there's no other sort of excuse to say apart from we've had resourcing issues. But we're not alone. There's a number of accounts that across the local government sector, a number of authorities haven't published their accounts or haven't had their accounts audited yet.
Councillor Austin.
Chris, can I just ask, are you confident that your finance team does actually have the capacity now to do all those things all at once? I'm thinking about all your additional responsibilities, all Matt's additional responsibilities, etc. Have you really got enough bodies to get all that work done?
Certainly Matt and I have been squeezed, so you'll be aware Matt's been Acting Director of Finance and Operations, which is a very unique set of services to be grouped together. I don't think that's a role you'll see anywhere else in the country. Someone managing a procurement team and a waste collection team at the same time. We're still probably a little way away because we need to get the corporate restructure has been approved, but we need to staff it. So we're probably looking at those interim arrangements being in place until June, but below myself and Matt, I'm confident the quality of staff that we've got at the moment. We have got some interims in to assist us. As I said, it's going to be a very busy period over the next few months, and we've got the ability to dip into that interim market. It's a little bit better than it was a year ago. I think COVID had a significant impact on it, on the quality of staff that we could get hold of and the working environment. Closure of accounts really is a team effort. Remote working is great if you're working in isolation, but when you need officers working together as a team, you really need them in co-located.
Okay, unless there's any other more comments or questions, I'll move on to the recommendation that the Governance and Audit Committee notes and make comments on as appropriate for this report. Please can I have a proposer? Councillor Towning, can I have a seconder? Councillor Dexter. Unless I hear any objection, I will take this as approved. Approved. Moving on to agenda item 7, procurement waivers for 2022 to 23. Please can I introduce Ms. Gemma Paul to introduce the report.
I'll actually introduce this report if that's okay. Gemma Paul is our procurement manager. It's her first time at committee tonight, I believe. So she's here in an observational capacity, but if you've got any specific questions about the content of the report, Gemma is the expert in the room on procurement and will be able to answer them. But I will obviously I'll introduce the report. Please go. She's a highly capable officer, knows the stuff, but be gentle with her on her first appearance at G&A tonight. I was looking straight at you, Cedric. Just keep those questions to me, that's fine. So this is the second time we've brought this report, so it's to committee. We brought it about a year ago. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to keep the momentum going, partly for the reasons we were just talking about, in terms of the stretch on resources in the finance team. I think this is a really useful report to bring to the committee because it gives you an indicator of instances where we've not effectively followed up the rules that are set out in our constitution. We've waived the rules. We've taken a deviation from those. And in terms of our procurement activity, that's very important because it's important that we demonstrate we're getting value for money and we are acting transparently in terms of our contracting activity with our suppliers. There are instances where we need to move swiftly and be nimble and not go for a thorough and full procurement process, and that's why we have this framework for waiving procurement rules in place. The report sets out, so again looking at the exec summary, just to walk you through this. The first table sets out the different limits and the rules that we have to follow for contracts of a certain value. What I should set out, this is the contract value, not the annual spend. So some contracts will be spread over 5 years. So for example, you could have a contract that's £50,000 over 5 years. That will fall into the top bracket, and you've got to go through a fully compliant procurement process, even though the annual spend is lower. If you then look at the table that's just at the bottom of the first page in the executive summary, you can see the number of instances where we have waived our procurement rules so far. So it's up to the middle of February. So 39 instances we approved it, and of those instances, you can see the breakdown of the different departments and the value of those contracts. You can see the large majority of them are of relatively low contract values, and there was only one instance when a waiver was presented to us and we said, no, you can't do this. The contract may have gone ahead, but it would be considered non-compliant. So it's not complied with our rules. That does place the council at some risk because we could be subject to challenge by a supplier or otherwise. That's the sort of the crux of the position where we are now. The other thing to note is we are looking to change the rules that we've got in place in terms of the contract values. You can see in that final paragraph in the executive summary that we're going to be moving that bottom limit from £10,000 up to £25,000. The reason for that, it will reduce some of the administration that officers have to undertake for relatively low contract values. Again, we could be talking about a 5-year contract that's worth £5,000 a year, so not huge sums of money, so that they've just got to be able to demonstrate they've got best value rather than going through and getting 3 written quotes and the like. The reason it's set at that 25,000 limit is there's some, Gemma will be able to tell you more if you want the particular detail. The public contract regs, have we got that right, 2015? We've got a post on our website, and a Kent and Medway-wide website, all contracts that are of a value of £25,000. So that's why the limits sort of tie in together, and we're looking to make the change to the Constitution to reflect that. It's been in the offering for a little while. The reason it's been delayed is we've been waiting for the corporate management team restructure to be finalised, and we're almost there. Happy to take any questions, and as it says in the recommendation, the report is for noting.
Councillor Austin.
I'm sorry. I'm noticing that I can see why we've got some waivers because of small value. I can see when we've not had enough people come forward, etc., etc. We also seem to have an awful lot of extreme urgency, and this has been something we've been concerned about. I know some of us members on other matters. Why did we have to make an urgent decision about buying bin wagons when we have to buy bin wagons every so many years anyway, etc. How do we compare with other authorities on this, and what are we doing about it if we don't compare well?
I would say, anecdotally on the face of it, Gemma may have a different view, and please feel free to contradict me. If I say it's difficult to make like-for-like comparisons to other authorities because we have different arrangements in place. So, for example, particularly the example you gave in terms of bin lorries. Some authorities have a completely contracted out waste collection service, so they wouldn't be doing that type of activity. I think it's a very valid point in terms of urgency, and I would say that's the one we probably push back most. Gemma and I had a conversation about one today where a waiver was presented to us in terms of being urgent in January, wasn't it? I think they first engaged with you. They went away, had another look at it, and they come back to us today saying, please waive it, it's urgent. And we've said no, because in the space between January and now, they could have actually undertaken a compliant procurement exercise. So we do push back hard on that. I think it's been partly possibly reflected of some of the limited resources that we've had at a senior management level. I would expect when we've got a fully staffed senior management team for us to see a reduction in the level of these urgent waivers, because we should have better management resources in place to manage these processes. Gemma, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more around the work you and your team are doing to produce the schedule of procurement that are upcoming in order to try and help officers know what is upcoming. Like you're saying, we know we're buying these freighters. They've got a life of 7 years. It shouldn't be a surprise in 7 years that we've got to buy some new ones. But Gemma, if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit more about that.
Yeah, certainly. So what we're doing at the moment, we're going to produce what we refer to as an internal contracts register. So it's basically to be like a tool for officers to help manage them through the current procurement process they're doing, also through to when it's awarded and what they have to put in place after that. So it's a way of having them all the documents in one location for them. They'll have all the details of the contract, whether they received a waiver for it, when the insurances are due. If you've got a 5-year contract, those insurances would be due every year, and it's the officer's responsibility to make sure that's in place as part of contract management. So the idea is it will help officers to program it in. They have all of the dates that they need to do, which should help get the next procurement on track, so they're aware ahead of time to put these things in place. It'll all be in one place for them, so they'll have a long list of ways that they can do that. We're also doing refresher training with officers across the council, and more training on roles and responsibilities, so they can understand what's from our side and what's from their side.
Great, thank you. So that's about training, so you cover that.
Councillor Towning.
I want to go back to the agency staff. Now, how do you actually deal with them when it comes to contracts? Because the fluctuation of different areas, like, the beach cleaning, for example, or you're talking about the dustmen, there's a lot of agency staff in there. What sort of formal contracts do you actually put together for these type of people? Because it's seasonal, some of it as well. So how do you work that out? How do you go about that?
Yeah, I'll try to answer that. So we do have a current agency framework in place. The idea is it was supposed to be for across the council, so including waste and recycling, operational services, all those types of roles, but it would also include admin. What we found with this contract is it didn't cover all of the roles, all the agency staff that might be required across the whole breadth of the council. It is coming to an end shortly. I understand that we have extended for this final year, because we can't find a framework that would take place of the whole council, and we're going to have to separate that requirement out going forward. So operational services would have a contract for themselves which is dedicated to those specific roles, and the rest of what we would call more specialist requirement or the basic admin things would be done through potentially a framework is what we're looking at the moment, rather than an open tender process. It's something that's been looked at the moment to get in place for that requirement, but there is a current contract in place.
So just to say, Gemma, you could probably describe this better, but just for the committee's benefit, when we're talking about framework contracts, so they are general contracts that you can, framework arrangements you can call off as and when. You don't have to go through a fully competitive process. It's already got on to... Absolutely, you can just select them through that. It's worth noting, so the arrangements Gemma talked about around op services and administration, but if you're looking at other professional staff, they wouldn't necessarily be on that, those types of contracts. So again, what we tend to do in those instances, get at least 3 businesses, agencies, recruitment agencies involved in it. If I'm looking for one in finance, I'll talk to Sipfer Penner, who are the recruitment agents there. I might talk to Michael Page or Reed or someone else. Other recruitment agencies are available to make sure we've engaged with them all, given them an opportunity, and we've got at least typically 3 quotes as well. But even with that, we tend to have to waive our contract standing orders, because the contracts are of high value. If you've got a senior member of staff that's with us for a length of time, that'll be a high value contract, and we haven't put it out through a full tender process. So we've tried to be competitive. We tried to make sure we've got value for money, but we haven't strictly complied with the requirements for procurement that are in our contract standing orders. Anything else you wanted to say to that, Gemma?
I think that covers that. I'd just say the actual framework that we have in place for the agency is one that we put in-house, so we did our own agency framework. So the idea is that you had, for certain requirements, you sort of had blocks of different roles. For that first set of role, you would go to who was considered the top ranked bidder of that tender process at the time, and then you go to the second one if they couldn't provide it, and the third one. For the what I would call more basic roles, where you've got the admin role side of it, the idea is that you would go to each of those 3 suppliers on the framework. You give them equal opportunity to provide an agency member staff and a quote for that. And then you get to pick, it's almost like what we refer to as a mini competition, and then we would put that in place.
Councillor Lees.
Yeah, thank you. I think probably just allied to what Councillor Austin was saying. The example I was going to pull out was that of the Winter Gardens on there, the Winter Garden security. And I think further up the report it says that lack of planning is not a justified issue for issuing a waiver. So who, in the example of the Winter Gardens we sort of knew that was going to happen for 6 months at least. Who is the ultimate decision maker as to whether or not there is lack of planning, or who does that come down to ultimately?
Well, it's me ultimately. Yeah, it is. So Gemma will advise, but there's a number of officers that have to sign off a waiver. First, it will be a corporate director. There's only a couple of us at the moment. So Bob Porter, for example, would sign it off as the director, saying this is something I endorse. Gemma would then review it as the procurement manager, say actually this is valid or not, and then I have to give the final sign off. So, for example, the conversation I was talking about earlier, the conversation Gemma and I had, it will be up between the two of us to say this is not a valid reason for a waiver. You might say we haven't got enough time, but we actually think there was sufficient time for you to plan this in, and you can go ahead and do this, but it will not be compliant, and we're not waiving it off. So they still can do it. I can't, unless it was something it's not necessarily illegal, it just puts us at risk, because another supplier, for instance, let's say hypothetically we're going to go out for a large security contract and we just awarded it to someone, another security supplier could say, why did you not engage with us? Why did you not go through a competitive process, and could effectively try and take us to court for loss of earnings or loss of potential profit.
Councillor Towning.
Do we have a formal compliance officer who looks at all our contracts and looks at the actual performance, like taking, for example, what we've just come up with, because compliance is a very important aspect of everything that we do. And do we have one?
It would depend on the contract, and then we don't have a centralised resource, but it will be embedded within the service. So if you think about housing or building, for example, housing have a large number of compliance officers within them when they look at the works that are done to our tenants' properties, because that's really important to make sure the safety and the quality of that work is a sufficient contract standard. But it will be more hit and miss depending on the contract value. We're not going to have high-level detailed compliance on an IT contract that's worth £5,000 over a couple of years. But if Dan's got a contract that he's with a supplier that he knows is high value, is business critical, he'll have someone in his team that will be looking at that to make sure the supplier Dan, I know your team's going through a lot of change, but you used to have those contract officers that would be holding them to account. So those compliance activities sit within the service rather than within Gemma's team, but it's not uniformly done across all contracts because we have to take a sort of a risk-informed decision as to whether it's worth doing it, because otherwise we'd possibly be spending more money, undertaking compliance activity on the contract than the contract's worth itself.
Councillor Austin.
Last one on this, I promise. The waivers which rely on, which are as a result of people not being able to meet our terms and conditions, doesn't that expose us to risk? Under what circumstances might that happen, and we'd be okay with it?
We always get legal to review them. It can be quite often. Again, I'm looking at Dan. Quite often, this happens with IT companies. Typically, is one of the areas we see it a lot. Quite often, they can be multinationals, and they'll just say they're the single player in town and go, no, these are our terms and conditions. You engage with us on these terms and conditions. Samira's probably, or Gemma, are probably better qualified to say in terms of the risk that it presents to us. When I'm looking at changes, I must say, for me, usually it's one of the lesser significant reasons why I'd be concerned around a waiver. When I'm looking at waivers, I'm really concerned about, are we getting value for money? Are we being transparent? Are we giving all suppliers equal footing? This is more around, if legal are happy with it, I'm usually happy, and I defer to legal that we're not exposed.
Thank you. Just to confirm that legal department do go through every single document, and they go through with a very fine tooth comb just to make sure that we are compliant. So everything that Chris and the team does, we go through it. We've got a couple of officers. We are short of staff, as I think across the board, but we do what we possibly can. And if we don't have capacity, there are external resources that I normally go to, and then we make sure that we are compliant.
Any other questions? No? Fab. The recommendation is that the committee notes the report. Please can I have a proposer and a seconder to review. Proposed by Councillor Lees, seconded by Councillor Towning. Unless I hear any objection, I will take this as approved. Fabulous. Moving on to agenda item 8, back to Mr. Chris Blundell. It's the Corporate Risk Management Quarterly Update.
Thank you, Chair. And if I may, I'm going to pass this over to Amy, who is our Risk and Insurance Officer, who is the sort of the author of this report and has done all the work. So without further ado, over to you, Amy.
Thank you, Chris. So the report, as you all know, provides the G&A Committee with a quarterly review of the corporate risks. So what I thought to do today is we're going to highlight some of the risks that have actually changed, and also highlight the risks on the annex that have actually gone up and down. We've got some exciting changes to the risk register and the way that we do it. We've actually changed the risk scoring mechanism, and the reason for that was because we were finding a lot of service risks were slipping into the corporate risk register, and so we wanted to delineate that properly. So just a bit of background, really. Most of you will know that the new risk management strategy was actually approved last July, and consequently we've been in the process now for some time of operating under the new risk management strategy. What I was saying a moment ago about the way we changed the scoring mechanism is so that we can remain agile with the way we manage our risks and the way that we look at the corporate risks as well. So this isn't just a set process that we're following every time. We're asking our officers, our directors and our managers to actually move with what we're doing in the risk management arena. So substantial progress has been made. Some of you will remember that we were only getting about 40 to 50% response rate this time last year. I'm happy to say that it's about 96% now. So we're actually getting responses from across the council. So this is the whole council. This isn't just one section. This is every single service, service across the council. And within those services, the managers are actually asking their guys on the ground to feed into the risk register. So we're actually getting some really good risks come through. And the best thing is that we've actually had some risks drop off, and that's really as a result of the proactive, approach that everyone's taking. So as a council, it's now possible to report these corporate risks to the committee in accordance to the updated risk management strategy. This is most notably demonstrated now in Annex 1, which we'll come to in a minute, and with the presentation of risks now through the lens of current, future and emerging risks. So rather than it just being a risk, we're actually delineating between where does the risk sit, and that actually really helps us to look at the mitigations of the risk. What can we do to actually improve the risks as well? So what I wanted to do was really just talk to you about the actual matrix that we've got. Now, most of you will be familiar with the matrix at the bottom of page 105, and that's the matrix that we've been using probably for some years. In fact, I think I've seen this for about 20 years in risk management. It's not really changed. And that's right. That is how we score our risks at the moment. So as you can see, you've got the likelihood against the impact. But what we found was that the way that people were scoring these risks was quite subjective. What was the likelihood? So they're going, oh, okay, it's a 4, but is it actually a 4? Where are we scoring that against? And the same with the impact. So what we've introduced this time is this new mechanism. So rather than just saying, okay, what is your idea of how the risk is going to be scored, we're saying that it has to go against these two tables. They're quite simple. The first one, which is actually the likelihood, this is actually asking them, is there a more than percentage? So that's actually giving us a real good idea of what is the actual likelihood. But probably the most impactful is the impact one, actually. And what we're actually asking people to do now is to score that particular risk against the headings of reputation, strategic well-being, service delivery, finance and compliance. We've then asked the directors, when they're scoring their corporate risks, is to give us what the highest one was. That then gives us an idea, and you'll see it further down the report, and I'll highlight it on two that have actually moved, where we're coming from. So what that's actually doing is it's actually eliminating some of the service risks off of the corporate risk. Of course, they're very important, but they don't belong on the corporate risk report because they're not a corporate risk. So I'm pleased to report that we've had no new risks, corporate risks this time. So if we go down to page 107, we will see that all the risks there remain the same in terms of the amount of risk that we've got on there. There has been a couple of changes, and what I was hoping to do was just draw out those two particular corporate risks. Of course, we can talk about any of the other corporate risks as and when, but what I was going to do was just draw out those first two. So we've got the Environmental Act that has sadly gone up, and we've also got, though, the Manston Building, which has gone down. Now, you'll note when we go down to the corporate risks that you can now see that we've got the impact scored and the likelihood scored. We've also got whether it's a current, future or emerging risk, or whether it sits in all three or two of them, because of course not all risks sit in one category. Some of them can actually straddle all of the categories. But the one thing that you'll notice now differently on the report this time from the last time was they were actually detailing whether it was reputation, service delivery and so on, which was the highest scoring risk mechanism. So if we go down first of all to the Environmental Act, we do know that that's gone up. The reason that's gone up actually is as far as I can surmise, is the timing of this. So the Environmental Act now, which is our current, future and emerging risk, and I'm sure this is a risk that's going to be very, very dear to a lot of councils' hearts at the moment as well. You can see from this we've got reputation, service delivery, strategic and financial risk score of 4. So that's actually increased. So that's actually why we've now got a 16 on there. But you can see that this is really delineating against what the actual risk is and where it sits within this matrix. If we go down to the Manston Road depot buildings, that's actually gone down, which is great news. That was a 16 before. The reason for that is because we're actually having work is underway to implement the required improvements and mitigate the risk moving forward. So that's a really good step in the right direction. Obviously, all the other corporate risks remain the same, and obviously we'll be happy to take questions on them afterwards. But what I would like to now point out is now the annex. So some of you might be familiar with the annex, some of you maybe not so much. So the annex really brought in by ourselves in this last year to not just highlight the corporate risk, but also to highlight the risks that sit just under there, because they're just as important sometimes. They're corporate risks, but they're sitting just under there. I am happy to report that there's no new risks to the annex, which is really great news. And we've actually had a couple drop off, so I'll just highlight the two that dropped off because that's really, really heartening to see that this is actually working and the risk process is working. So the Jackie Bakers, the old workshop of Jackie Bakers, we are to remove this risk. As you can see from the notes there, the site's been secured and so on and so forth. There's notice has been, to my knowledge, has been placed. There has been a small delay due to asbestos. But again, this has been notified to the HSE and work remains going forward. So this will now drop off of the annex. And the second one that has going to be dropping off is, and I think we discussed this one actually at one of the committees a couple of last year, which was the inappropriate watercraft use, such as jet skis. I'm pretty sure we did actually discuss this. So the reason this is now dropping off of the annex is because we've got 5 coastal enforcement officers due to be employed in 2023. So obviously as these go along, what we do is every time we look at the risk again, see if it's been updated, and this is how we're going to report it. You will note that everything else remains the same on there as well, and that is it. And you can also see from the annex, the other thing I would like to point out on the annex as well is that we've actually delineated between the current, future and emerging, and so that's really quite helpful for you to understand where that risk sits with the council. So what we'd like to do going forwards is we would like to look at some risk tracking. This is quite in its infancy, so what we'd like to be able to demonstrate to the committee in the future is the progress of the risk without it just being me reading out exactly what's happened with them. So we've been investigating various different ideas, pie charts, graphs, etc. We need a bit more data to be able to put on there, obviously, before we can start producing that. So that's briefly the annex and the risk register for this, the risk report for this particular quarter. Happy for any questions.
Councillor Lees.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've got 2 questions, if that's all right. One is about the report itself. I'm sure when I had a look earlier, there was something in the report that mentioned Dreamland and Faith in Strangers in particular, and there being a lack of budget to facilitate compliance officer. I've just had a look now and it's gone, so I don't know if there can be any clarification other than that. It looked a bit odd when I saw it the first time, but...
That's an old version of the annex that shouldn't have been published. The reasons for this, pretty much as Amy was saying, there were some risks on there that officers had highlighted for management's attention, but they weren't really corporate risks. They were service-related risks. So, for example, I think there's some detail in there around the budgetary implications, and we're looking at like less than £10,000. So we'll spend that money to address it. Is effective. If it's not in their budget, they'll have to overspend to sort it out. So again, looking at that table, the lowest scoring risk, a 1, is less than £50,000. So unless it's a problem, a financial problem, or it's a big reputational issue, because then it's going to be in like the local press, it's not going to become a corporate issue. It's a service issue and it's something they need to sort out, but it shouldn't have been on that report. And that's part of what Amy was doing to push back on those officers. And unfortunately, an older version of that annex that was considered by management was published.
Yeah, no, the only reason it stood out is because it looked a lot a lot different to everything else.
Yeah.
The other thing is just about cyber attack, and I've got a question. Excuse me. There's a sentence that reads, unfortunately the cyber market is now not conducive to our risk profile. What does that mean, please?
Yes, so I've worked in insurance for many years and I've worked in risk management for some time now, and I've seen the changes to the cyber market. The issue with the cyber market is it's gone into what's called a hard cycle, and Dan can probably agree to that. So whereas it used to be a buyer's market, it's now a seller's market. The restrictions and the contingencies that the insurers expect us to have in order just to get a basic level of cyber insurance is prohibitive. It's stupidly expensive, and I hate to use the expression, it's probably not worth the paper it's written on at the moment. The cyber market is not in a good place, so really we need to be looking at at the risk ourselves. We need to be looking at how do we mitigate that risk, how do we self-insure ourselves. There's a lot of talk at the moment around cyber risk engineering as opposed to cyber insurance. So it's actually getting your company to the right position, and Dan can probably provide a lot more detail on that, but getting your company or organisation to the right position that they've mitigated and limited those risks. So that's what it's meant by the right now cyber insurance might not be the way forward for most local authorities and most private companies.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I was just going to add, before we go into the detail on cyber, we have got Dan to give us an update about some private session of the committee, so rather than going into any detail in terms of how we're addressing security risks, but very good question around the insurance market, so thank you.
Councillor Garner.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd just like to ask about a couple of the risks in the annex related to the upcoming election and voter ID. You've highlighted the risk of not being able to find experienced staff to work at the polling stations. We're not very far off now. So, I mean, I was going to say, obviously, the staff who work in the polling stations are going to have a lot more to do this time. There's going to be a lot more responsibility, and there's going to be they're going to need more training. So at this stage of the process, it might maybe sound more Chris really, but for an update on where we are with this, how concerned are we that we're not going to be ready if we are concerned about it, or how ready are we going to be? Thank you.
We are concerned about it. I think that's a fair comment. I think some staff have some hesitation or reticence around the actual additional work that will be involved and possible conflict they may be subject to because of the voter ID. It's new. People don't know what they're going to be coming up against. We're getting there in terms of the number of presiding officers that we need at the polling stations. I managed to coerce and convince Dan to be one earlier this week, so we've got a couple more that we need to find, a little bit of gentle arm twisting. But yeah, it's necessary for us to find as many as possible. If not, we will obviously need to look externally. That's an option for us to recruit external staff. You don't need to be councillor staff to work on the elections, but the elections are hugely important for us. Any election is obviously a very important exercise, particularly when you're dealing with district elections. It's the first time that some new councillors may come into contact with council officers. So we need to show that we can run an election if you think we can run a council, but otherwise it doesn't create a very good first impression. So we are fully engaged with it, and we're pulling out all the stops.
Just ask a follow-up on that. Are we including in the processes here, we're going to keep in track of voters who aren't able to vote because they have the inappropriate ID? So as at the end of the election, we'll be able to show how many people haven't been able to vote and the reasons why they haven't been able to vote.
I don't know the answer to that, but I will. I'll speak to the elections team and ensure you get a written response. Thanks.
Councillor Austin.
Wanted to pick up on an item in the annex, not in terms of our process or whatever, but in terms of the idea of removing it, which is the business about the jet skis, which is causing. The officer decision has been published and has caused immediate great concern in the community. The only place that we are now allowing jet skis to launch from is a shallow public beach with no other forms of protection or separation between the jet skis and swimmers. It's used by young families. It's a real worry, and we haven't as yet, as local councillors, it's somewhere very close to where I live, it's where I swim myself, we haven't had any information as yet about what we're planning on doing practically to mitigate the risks to beach users. So I'm a bit worried about that not appearing on the schedule somewhere, because I think perhaps it needs to be monitored. Obviously, we know we're going to have new officers, but they're not going to be there all the time. We need actual physical barriers of some kind, some means of making sure that people are safe.
So in terms of that not being on the schedule, so this was compiled and completed prior to that decision notice being produced. Amy, as part of her work, will be working closely with the coastal team. Lisa and Mike Cumber. Again, I'm afraid I don't have the specifics to hand of how we're going to manage the risks associated with that decision. It's probably best to direct that through to Lisa, Luke and Mike. Yeah. It will be picked up as part of the regular cycle. Thank you.
Thank you for your report, Amy. There was just one part on it, and it's only noticeable because it's in red, but the date says updated 30th of March.
I was hoping no one was going to notice that, and I couldn't get round to change it. I noticed it about half an hour before the meeting, so I will amend that, but it should have said January, so we're not in the future yet. So apologies to members on that one. I will amend that. All right. Yes, I know. Thank you.
Thank you. Where are we? So the recommendation is to approve the review of corporate risks and discuss annexed risks. Please can I have a proposer and a seconder to approve the review. Proposed by Councillor Duckworth. And seconded by Councillor Lees. Unless there's I hear any objection, I'll take this as approved. Cool. Moving on to agenda item 9, Homes England Audit New Build. Now, I have Mr. Bob Porter here to introduce the report, so unless he's doing an imaginary...
I don't think he's hiding. I can introduce this. I did have a chat with Bob about it in advance. It's fairly straightforward. It's relatively, I'd say, good news. We have to engage with Homes England in terms of the funding they provide us, and the schemes are subject to audits. So Grant Thornton have done it, as you can see in the report, completely clean audit. So we're just presenting this to the committee in terms of full disclosure that it's had a satisfactory and full and clear audit. So lots of green lights and green ticks on this one.
Fab. Any comments, questions? No? Brilliant. So the committee is asked to note the final grade award of green. No breaches identified. Please can I have a proposer and a seconder? Proposed by Councillor Shrub and seconded by Councillor Towning. Unless I hear any objection, I will take this as approved. Move on to agenda item 10, which is the exclusion of public and press. The recommendation that the public and press be excluded from the meeting for agenda item 11 as it contains exempt information as defined in paragraph 7 of Schedule 12A, Part 1 of the Local Government Act 1972. Paragraph 7, any action taken or to be taken in connection with the prevention, investigation of prosecution of crime. Please can I have a proposer and a seconder. Proposed by Councillor Shrub, seconded by Councillor Lees. Unless I hear any objection, I will take this as approved. Fab. We will take a slight pause just so we can stop the recording and evacuate any imaginary